Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Muhammad with the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture. I'm a professor of agricultural economics, and I primarily work on international agricultural trade issues. And I'd like to thank you all for this invitation. And I am sure as we move forward, my goal is for all of us to know a lot more about agricultural trade, and particularly the implications of what's taken place over the last few years, as well as what's taking place now, and how that's impacted U.S. agricultural exports as well as the state of Tennessee. Now, one of the things I'd like to always do is just to start off with a very basic question, like how important is international trade to U.S. agriculture? And so if we go to my first slide, one of the things you'll see is that international trade accounts for a little over 20% of U.S. agricultural production. But that's clearly going to depend on the commodity or the product. And so prior to the U.S.-China trade war, about half of all the soybeans we produce went to foreign markets. About 3/4 of all cotton that we produce is shipped to international markets. But then when you get a case like sort of livestock products, say such as beef, where the amount that we export may only be 10%, but that 10% makes U.S. beef one of our largest agricultural exports. So the point is, agricultural exports are important to U.S. ag production, and our reliance on these foreign markets are really important to the incomes of farmers, as well as the overall value of the agricultural sector. And so the next slide is just showing a breakdown of U.S. agricultural exports by category. So whether it's the bulk commodity area, intermediate products, consumer-oriented products, as well as what's called agriculture-related products such as ethanol, distilled spirits, forestry products. The one thing I want you to see from this slide is what's our leading agricultural export. So soybeans by far is our leading agricultural export. And in the year 2019, we exported, nearly $19 billion, making that our largest agricultural export category. Some of the other larger categories I mentioned, beef. We also export quite a lot of forestry products, and it's ranked quite high. And in fact, if you consider forestry products part of the overall agricultural spectrum, it's often ranked second or third. We rely a lot at one point. We relied a lot on China for cotton exports, and at one point that was one of our leading categories, but that's since declined due to some internal policies in the Chinese market. But as a result, we have a more diversified market for cotton, where we export a lot more to Vietnam and other sources, unlike soybeans, where we really relied mostly on China. So to go to the next slide, what you'll see is just sort of how much agriculture in terms of agricultural exports have grown since the year 2000. And the point I want you to see here is just the overall growth. So since the year 2000 up until about 2014, agricultural exports increased nearly 200%, so about 193%. The other thing I want you to see is since that time, exports have been leveling off and becoming relatively flat. And so a lot of what has taken place due to the trade war, as well as to what's taking place with COVID-19 now, that's impacting U.S. agricultural exports. Note that long before that, we'd, at least in terms of value, have been seeing a leveling off of that significant growth. So if we go to the next slide, what we could see then is a breakdown of those exports as it relates to the destination market. And so as you could see from this slide, that much of that growth that we've experienced over the last 20 years has been due to a rise of China as a major purchaser of U.S. agricultural commodities. And so China had gone from being a relatively insignificant buyer to, at one point in the early 2010s, around 2011 and 12, being the leading market for U.S. agricultural exports. And then one of the things I want you to see is that at some point it went back and forth with Canada, but note the significant decline in exports to China as a result of the trade war. that the decline went from about 20 billion down to less than 10 billion. And so we lost quite a bit in terms of agricultural trade with China. The fortunate thing is that since has recovered in 2019, but we have not yet reached 2017 levels in terms of U.S. agricultural exports to the Chinese market. The next thing I'd like to highlight is just sort of what does agricultural trade mean to Tennessee? And I'll be real quick with this point, is just simply to say that we export to some of the same markets that the U.S. exports to nationally. However, we also rely a little bit more on Vietnam in terms of the cotton that we export. We also rely a little bit more on the United Kingdom and Europe in terms of distilled spirits and forestry products. But we, like other U.S. States, where a lot of what we produce and export ends up in the Chinese market. And so the next slide is just simply a breakdown, and I won't go through this in detail, but these are what the Economic Research Service recalls state export data, and they try to make some attempt to break down state exports for individual commodities and rank those states. And so what I'd let you do now is just sort of take a look at where Tennessee ranks relative to the 50 states in these other product categories. All right, so now let's move to the Trade Outlook 2020. All right, what are the expectations for U.S. agricultural trade moving forward? But to get there, we do need to think about what happened this most recent year. And so in 2019, U.S. agricultural exports were down about 1%. When you throw in related products like forestry and fishery and products and distilled spirits, U.S. agricultural exports were down about 2.4%. And you may think, well, we were in a trade war, and these declines are relatively small, considering all the things that we had heard in the news and press. But then if we break this down by individual commodities, one of the things that you'll see is that all commodities are not created equal in terms of how they were impacted by this trade war with China. Soybeans down 13%, corn down 16%, coarse grains, so that's excluding corn, down 47%, tobacco down near 30%, pulses down 26%, forest products down 16%, fish products down 10%. And so the point is, so even though overall agricultural trade went down by 1.1%, for a lot of these individual categories, U.S. agricultural exports suffered more so than the average. Now when you get to Tennessee is where you really do see significant declines for the state, particularly in the area of forest products and distilled spirits, as well as tobacco to a lesser degree. But so Tennessee distilled spirits exports down 36%, forest product exports down about 40%. And then when you look solely at China for forest products such as logs and lumber, that was actually down near 75%. And so, given these declines, the USDA is still forecasting agricultural exports to increase in the year 2020. However, they've revised that forecast downward due to COVID-19. And so, well, what are the things that are sort of driving this expected increase? And a big part of that is what I'm showing on the next slide, and that is this phase one trade agreement with China, where this is the first time where a country has committed to dedicated agricultural purchases in a trade agreement. And in fact, what the Chinese have committed to amounts to about 100% increase in U.S. agricultural exports to China compared to what they did in 2017, which was before the trade war. And if they are able to satisfy those commitments on average, and let's say that's sort of spread out over different commodities at that particular proportion, we're talking about 300% and 400% increases in agricultural exports and products like soybeans, cotton, and other commodities compared to 2019. And so the expectation is this trade agreement, if the Chinese are able to satisfy their commitments, will carry U.S. agricultural exports in 2020. while at the same time these other trade agreements in terms of the second round of NAFTA, USMCA, our new trade agreement with Japan, and then these expected agreements with the UK and other places could then propel U.S. agricultural exports forward. All right, so lastly, I'm going to conclude with two slides. The first slide is, well, what's been the implications of COVID-19 on U.S. and Tennessee agricultural exports? And so the best we could do at this point is look at agricultural trade in the year 2020 from January to April and compare that to January to April in 2019. One thing to note there is that 2019 was actually a particularly bad year because the trade war was in full swing. And so thinking about declines compared to 2019 actually says that we declined even beyond sort of what was taking place during the trade war, where products were actually facing higher trade tariffs in destination markets. And so what did we see? So soybeans, obviously, since we rely on the Chinese market, if we compare the first 4 months of 2020 to the first 4 months of 2019, soybeans are down about 15.6%, corn down about 13%, forest products down about 11%. But then all markets have not faced declines. Note that, say, for the pork market, where the Chinese, they were suffering from African swine fever, and they still are suffering from that, relying more on imported protein. And so as a result, pork products continue to rise, even in spite of the difficulties of COVID-19. Now, in terms of what's taken place for the state of Tennessee, we've seen some significant declines in quite a few areas. Overall agricultural exports for the state down 11% the first 4 months of 2020 compared to 2019. Our cotton exports now near 19%, but we have seen some increases in distilled spirits. So apparently during these tough times, people tend to know what to go through to sort of get through cabin fever and other issues of what it feels like to be sort of isolated. Processed foods have gone up quite a bit. One of the things we've seen is a further decline in Tennessee forestry product exports, as well as a 90% decline in the dairy products that we do export from the state. Pork down about 62% for the state, even though it's actually higher nationally, and beef products down near 70%. And so I'll close with this, some final thoughts. So even though COVID-19 has had some negative impacts on U.S. and Tennessee agricultural exports, the USDA is sort of thinking about trade moving forward, that they still expect to see some gain over 2019. A lot of that is about what the Chinese have committed to do with this phase one trade agreement. But it's also based on the benefits of some other agreements and the expectations, and that's with Korea, USMCA, that's Canada and Mexico, our agreement with Japan, and also thinking about the benefits of some potential trade agreements moving forward. The real question, though, is can China live up to the commitments in the phase one trade deal? And I know quite a few people have questions, because to think about a 100% increase, say, in soybean imports from the United States, and how that could displace South American soybeans from Brazil and Argentina, and then how would that then impact how they would then sort of take a case to the WTO, because this is the first time that a country has sort of committed to dedicated purchases in a trade agreement, and we're not quite sure how that's going to play out legally in terms of the World Trade Organization. Lastly, I'll just say, in terms of what's happened with COVID-19, one of the things we've seen is a decrease in demand for final products, and so we shop less, so we buy less cotton in terms of the clothing and other factors in products where cotton is a primary input, hence decreasing the demand for those products, while at the same time then decreasing the demand for cotton used in those products, as well as, say, for forestry products and furniture production. We've also seen labor shortages on both sides in terms of our agricultural production, as well as labor shortages at the ports and labor shortages in the foreign countries that import U.S. products. There's been a decrease in, obviously, resources dedicated to international trade, and that's clearly a function of less labor being able to be involved in exporting and importing activities. But the point I want you to note is all exports have not decreased as a result. Some have remained robust and strong, and particularly the case is pork products. A lot of that having to do with foreign markets tend to demand what we do not consume in terms of the products, pork products we consume domestically. So with that, I thank you all. I appreciate the time, and I hope that you all enjoyed this presentation as well as the overall meeting and conference. Goodbye.